Long before European ships dropped anchor on its shores, the North American continent was home to sophisticated, thriving native societies. But for the explorers navigating the Atlantic in the 17th century, this vast, resource-rich land represented a blank canvas for opportunity. That opportunity exacted a brutal toll. The push to conquer the New World devastated indigenous populations through war and disease. To extract the wealth of the land, colonists turned to human bondage, importing the first enslaved Africans to Virginia in 1619. By the late 1700s, those same colonial settlements had grown wealthy and fiercely protective of their own independence. Frustrated by heavy-handed British taxation and a lack of representation, they sought to govern themselves, eventually sparking a revolution against the crown. To justify their rebellion, the founders penned a document built on a radical assertion. Look at the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Right there, in its founding charter, the United States established a glaring contradiction. It proclaimed a universal right to liberty while systematically relying on the enslavement of human beings. Following the revolution, the young country faced a massive logistical challenge. They needed to bind 13 economically diverse colonies into a single functional government. To get the southern states to agree to this new constitution, the framers had to make a deal. They intentionally protected the institution of slavery, writing it directly into the legal framework of the Republic. This created a uniquely fragile experiment. A single political system was now trying to house two entirely opposed realities: a thriving agrarian slave economy in the South and an increasingly industrialized free labor economy in the North. By codifying slavery into the nation's highest law, the framers ensured that the collision between freedom and bondage was only delayed. In the first half of the 19th century, the United States pushed aggressively outward. Through massive acquisitions like the Louisiana Purchase and the annexation of Texas, the country's footprint rapidly doubled. This growth was fueled by an ideology known as manifest destiny, the deeply held belief that Americans were divinely ordained to settle the entire continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Clearing that land required brutal federal action. Policies like the Indian Removal Act violently displaced tens of thousands of Native Americans, sending tribes like the Cherokee on the deadly forced march known as the Trail of Tears. As the borders expanded, so did the political crisis back in Washington. Every new mile of territory ignited a bitter fight in Congress over whether each new state admitted to the Union would allow slavery or be free. Adding more land brought enormous wealth, but it also stretched the original constitutional compromise to its absolute limit, destroying the fragile balance of political power. By the 1850s, political negotiations began to collapse entirely. When the government allowed new territories to vote on the legality of slavery themselves, settlers flooded into places like Kansas, sparking a localized civil war that killed hundreds. The violence soon reached the East. In 1859, a radical preacher named John Brown launched a raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, hoping to arm enslaved people and ignite a rebellion. He was captured and executed, polarizing the nation even further. The final fracture came in 1860. The Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, ran on a platform expressly designed to halt the Western expansion of slavery. When he won the presidency, the South saw the writing on the wall. Unwilling to accept a government that threatened their slave economy, Southern states seceded. In April 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on the federal garrison at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The American Civil War had begun. The conflict was the bloody, unavoidable reckoning of a nation that tried to stand as a beacon of liberty while chaining millions of its people. The conflict quickly escalated into an industrial slaughter. Over 4 years, the war consumed the nation, leaving entire cities in ruins and claiming the lives of roughly 600,000 Americans. As the casualties mounted, Lincoln redefined the objective of the fight. By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he directed the military to actively dismantle slavery in the rebellious states. To secure that outcome, the Union Army adopted a doctrine of total war. Under the command of generals like Ulysses S. Grant, federal forces relentlessly ground down the Confederate military and its economy. eventually forcing a final surrender in 1865. A military victory required a permanent legal solution. Before the war even ended, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, striking the institution of slavery from the United States Constitution forever. For the first time since the country's founding, the legal reality of the nation was being forced to align with the radical promise written into the Declaration of Independence. The post-war era, known as Reconstruction, brought massive constitutional changes. The 14th and 15th Amendments were ratified to guarantee birthright citizenship, equal protection, and voting rights for millions of formerly enslaved Black Americans. But progress was met with immediate, organized terror. Across the South, white supremacist groups waged a campaign of violence and intimidation to suppress these new rights and reestablish social control. The political will to protect Black citizens eventually fractured. To settle a heavily contested presidential election in 1877, the federal government agreed to withdraw its troops from the South, effectively abandoning Reconstruction altogether. Without federal protection, Black Americans were subjected to decades of systemic disenfranchisement. The Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws, enforcing strict segregation and unchecked racial violence for nearly a century. The abolition of slavery left the fight for true equality unfinished. The story of the United States remains a continuous, centuries-long struggle by its people, demanding that the nation actually live up to the creed it was founded upon.